Hello. Today we will be discussing the policies and impacts of Mao Zedong's tenure as leader of the People's Republic of China from 1949 till his death in 1976. Now this is of course the second part of this two-part series about the rise and impact of communism in China. So the first part dealt with the rise of communism and Mao Zedong to power in China, whereas the second part will focus on what they did once they were actually in power. So I would highly recommend that you go watch that first video, especially if you want more context around a whole bunch of the things that are about to be explored in this video. But all you really need to know for this video is that by 1949, the Chinese Communists, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, had won the Chinese Civil War, defeating the Chinese nationalists, and in 1949 proclaimed the creation of the new People's Republic of China. So, rolling into the 1950s, they of course began implementing their policies, but a particular event would occur that would sort of thrust China back onto the world stage. That, of course, being the Korean War. Now, a quick bit of background on this. So, after World War II, Japanese-occupied Korea was split up into a Soviet-controlled occupation zone in the north, a US-controlled one in the south. The Soviets set up a communist government in the north, the US set up a capitalist government in the south, and in 1950 the North invaded the South. So it was effectively a civil war, and the North Koreans, under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, launched an invasion of South Korea and pushed them all the way back to the port city of Busan, and at which point then a United Nations intervention, led by the US, then intervened on South Korea's behalf and pushed the North almost all the way back to the border with China. And this is where things get interesting. As you see, many in the PRC, including Mao, were quite worried about the idea that, well, if the UN actually reaches the Chinese border, they might just keep going. And there was some credence to this theory, most notably with General Douglas MacArthur, the overall commander of the Allied forces in Korea, wanting to do this, wanting to just keep on going to, keep on fighting communism. And he famously proposed dropping a line of nuclear bombs in order to create a sea of irradiated cobalt in order to keep the Chinese away. But in any case, the PRC under Mao decided to intervene on North Korea's behalf and push the UN forces back to approximately where the border was before the war. So a whole bunch of people died for effectively nothing. But of course, this did still have a number of major effects. The Korean War is and the Chinese intervention in particular is the reason why the Korean Peninsula is still split to this very day. It was also the first proxy war of the Cold War, which sort of set the trend for the rest of the Cold War, with proxy wars between the US and the USSR, largely being how the war was fought. And, of course, it also demonstrated the strength of the new People's Republic of China, and sort of thrust them back into the world stage in a big way. So, after that, they were free to turn back to implementing their planned policies. This included a lot of the sort of standard communist policies of, land redistribution and nationalisation of everything and whatnot, but also they had some more unique policies, such as, from 1956 to 1957, the 100 Flowers campaign, which promoted freedom of speech, criticism of the government, and democracy. Yeah, it turns out it was just a trap, as anyone who used the 100 Flowers campaign as an opportunity to actually critique the government and critique Mao were then later rounded up and arrested. So, yeah, it was literally just a massive trap for any remaining critics. And also during this time, we see the development of the Sino-Soviet split, as Mao had been an ardent follower of Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. Now, Stalin died in 1952 and was succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev, who sought to reform the Soviet Union and distance himself from Stalin. In fact, he actually denounced Stalin in his famous secret speech. Well, what this did was drive a wedge between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, which would continue to develop more and more until by 1961 the PRC had finally officially denounced the Soviet Union. And what's more, the two nations would eventually end up actually engaging in border clashes around the border in Manchuria. These border clashes wouldn't amount to much of anything really, but it still clearly demonstrated the sheer scale of the Sino-Soviet split. But then we also see the implementation of one of Mao's main policies, the so-called Great Leap Forward. This was his attempt to effectively try and emulate what Stalin had did in the Soviet Union, and rapid industrialization and a rapid overhaul of agriculture. Except Mao had sort of tried to rush it and do both the overhaul of agriculture and the industrialization at the same time. The effect was disastrous. On the industry front, and the official instruction for Chinese citizens during this time was to build furnaces in their back gardens and then melt down all of their cooking utensils in order to make steel. The end result was unusable steel and a whole bunch of wasted cooking utensils. But more importantly, and this is the main reason why the Great Leap Forward is so well remembered these days, is because of the agricultural reforms. So we see a lot of sort of collectivizing of farms, so merging all these different farms together into these great bigger collectives and nationalizing them, moving people from the cities into the farms. So a massive overhaul. And we also see the introduction of the Four Pests campaign, which sought to eradicate the so-called four pests threatening Chinese agriculture. And one of them was the sparrow. Yeah, it turns out that the sparrow had actually been keeping down the populations of insects such as locusts. And so once they got rid of the sparrows, these insects populations exploded, which then ate all the crops and caused one of, if not the single greatest famine in all of human history. This was a major embarrassment for not only PRC but also for Mao personally, and although he would remain as the leader of the PRC, he would temporarily see himself get somewhat sidelined a bit. Although he wouldn't exactly take this lying down. So, moving into the 1960s, we have further developments such as Mao writing his Little Red Book, a book full of quotations from Chairman Mao, which the way that I can best describe it is as being like the PRC's equivalent of the Bible, or effectively, as it was seen with this great level of reverence, and basically every Chinese citizen had to have a copy of the Little Red Book and had to be able to recite verses from it from memory. And it became perhaps one of the greatest extensions of Mao's already massive cult of personality that further cemented his control over the Chinese nation. Here we also see the simplification of the Chinese language. And this is still present today, with modern Mandarin Chinese being this simplified version Chinese that was introduced under Mao and the Communist Party. And funnily enough, whilst the simplified Chinese is used on the Chinese mainland, on Taiwan, where the Chinese nationalists fled to after the Civil War, on Taiwan they still use traditional Chinese characters. So there's now a linguistic divide that has been the direct result of the PRC taking power. So, yeah, that was a significant impact on Chinese culture as a direct result of the rise of communism. Then in 1966, we see the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution was a incredibly chaotic decade, which saw Chinese teenagers and children organised into brigades known as Red Guards, who would then go around cities and towns and dragging people, well, particularly anyone that could be that was deemed to be a critic of Chairman Mao, a critic of the Communist Party, or in some way an enemy of the Communist Party, a so-called rightist, a vaguely defined term which basically just came to mean anyone who was opposed to Mao and his rule, or supported more or capitalist style economic policies. So they basically drag them out of their homes and formally denounce them, and publicly humiliate them, and often kill them. And this was all in an effort to eradicate the so-called four olds: old ideas, old customs, old culture, and old habits. In doing so, effectively erasing the old previous Chinese culture and creating a new communist one centered around Mao. And the effects of that are still very much in place today, as large parts of Chinese culture, history, and literature, vast amounts of ancient artifacts relating to Chinese history were destroyed during this time. So it did immense damage to Chinese culture and history. During this time, we also see re-education initiatives introduced, such as forcing kids from the cities and forcibly taking them out into the countryside to be re-educated by the peasantry. And if you've ever read Balzac and the Little Chinese Seamstress, the story takes place in amongst one of these re-education programs where the two main characters get sent away from the city into the countryside to be re-educated. So that's what it sought to do. So is re-educating them by the peasantry, which sought to also indoctrinate them even further into communist and Maoist ideology. So rolling into the 1970s, we see further developments internationally, such as in the 1970s we see the People's Republic of China finally recognised as the legitimate Chinese government by the UN. As prior to this point, the UN was still recognising the Republic of China, which had been kicked out to Taiwan, as the legitimate Chinese government. Well, after constant pressure from other communist states, particularly including Albania, the UN finally voted to officially recognise the PRC as the legitimate Chinese government. And to this day, Taiwan is not officially recognised as a sovereign state by the United Nations, and it's only recognised by a handful of countries, including Vatican City. So, then also during this time we see a bit of detente between the US and China. This is already happening between the US and the Soviets under US President Richard Nixon, but it also extends a bit to China, where we see this, as after recognition was granted to the PRC, we see this normalisation of relations, and the US beginning to form some closer ties with China, especially trying to utilise the Sino-Soviet split to their advantage. And so we see them become a little bit less antagonistic towards each other, to the point where they're able to do things such as, for instance, host ping-pong competitions against each other, ping-pong diplomacy, which showed a bit of a step forward towards the normalisation of Sino-American relations. And this continues right up until 1976, with Mao's death. And this, well, it was certainly the end of an era in China. It marked the end of Mao and his brutal authoritarian reign over the country. Now, he was initially sort of succeeded by the Gang of Four, who were a group of Communist Party politicians, including Mao's last wife, who was commonly referred to as Madame Mao, who and while the Gang of Four, they sought to uphold Mao's policies, particularly with the Cultural Revolution, and if anything, take it even further. So they kept on propagating the Cultural Revolution, but they weren't particularly popular. And now that Mao was gone, they no longer really had their main source of support and protection. And as a result, by October of that very same year, the Gang of Four was overthrown in a coup. And the result of this coup, who saw this man, Deng Xiaoping, take control in China. And Deng Xiaoping, much like Khrushchev had done with Stalin, tried to somewhat distance himself from Mao. Famously, in a speech, he famously declared that Mao was 70% right and 30% wrong. And so what Deng did is, sure, he continued on with some Mao's policies, like China continued to be communist, or at least call itself communist. And he continued to, and even to this day, the PRC still reveres Mao Zedong. However, Deng then also did other things, such as introducing in some forms of capitalism and free enterprise. And these are the main reasons why China is the superpower it is today, and why the Chinese Communist Party has been able to hold on to power. It's because of these capitalist reforms that were brought in under Deng Xiaoping. And so ultimately, Mao and his policies had an immense effect on China, on Chinese culture, on Chinese society. Effects which are still very much felt to this day. And even in China today, you can still see a very pronounced cult of personality for Mao, even now, 49 years after his death. If you can still see a great reverence held for him, and the continuation of and propagation of the idea as Mao being the father of the nation, and father of the Chinese nation in some regards, and so he had and continues to have an immense impact over Chinese history and world history at large. So, if you liked the video, please be sure to like, comment and subscribe. If you have any further questions or any topics that you'd like to see me cover, please leave them in the comments down below, and I will be sure to respond to as many of them as I can. And so, in short, thank you for watching, and goodbye. I'll be seeing you in the next video.